Hello and welcome to the last video in the macroeconomic Unit 4 range, and it's on the European Union, always a controversial topic. Let's go! Back in the day we didn't have the European Union, we had the European Economic Community, also known as the EEC. It was formed in 1958 and it only had 6 members: Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany, France and Italy. It had a few characteristics as well. It was basically a common market, and this was the first big common market which had the free movements of goods, services, persons and capital between all of those 6 countries. They also eliminated protectionism within those countries, but it had a common external tariff which was 25%, I believe. There was provision for the EEC competition policy, so basically they wanted to encourage competition between all of the countries. Obviously that increases efficiency and stuff like that. And there was also the first common agricultural policy, which is always quite important. Obviously the European Union has one of them as well. And that's basically a load of subsidies to do with farming and stuff like that, but you don't really need to know about it. You may or may not be surprised to see that Britain isn't on the list of members. It was because it preferred freer trade and it didn't like the idea of having this external tariff. It was also quite a free market thinker, so it was very against government intervention, which would have occurred if they had been in the EEC. And even though it wasn't in the EEC, it was also in the EFTA, which is the European Free Trade Area, which allowed members to trade freely amongst themselves, and then the members could fix up their own tariffs with non-members rather than having the fixed 25% external tariff that the EEC had. Moving on to the European Union, founded on the 1st of November 1993, I believe, currently has 28 member countries. Obviously there were lots of agreements before 1993, but the EU itself, if you look online and stuff, it says it was founded in 1993. So the EU, when it was actually called the EU, 1993. So let's look at the institutional structure of the EU. So basically all the stuff inside it. We've got our Council of Ministers, and they basically decide on all the major laws and policy changes, and they represent each nation's interests. So they're made up of ministers from each state. Moving on now to the Commission. These represent the interests of the EU as a whole, so people that represent the whole of the EU. They're responsible for ensuring that EU laws and policies that have been decided on by the ministers are carried out and implements decisions of the Council. It also controls more minor areas of legislation that aren't looked at by the Council of Ministers, and the Commission, because it represents the EU as a whole, might actually disagree with some member states. The European Parliament's probably the one that you've heard most about because it's got the MEPs in it, and it's basically got members from each state proportional to population. I know we were given an extra MEP the other day. I think it was our 73rd MEP. In the last election it was actually a bit of a shock because UKIP came first. I think they got 24 seats, then it was Labour with 20 seats, and then Conservatives with 19. And then a few of the smaller parties had seats as well. So obviously a lot of people thought this was to try to evoke change. People wanted to create a reaction to get change, and they want to say, look, we're not happy. But obviously if you've seen some videos of Nigel Farage in the EU, in the sort of European Parliament, it's a bit, well. And basically the European Parliament have very little power to make new laws. They don't have much power at all. They just seem to argue all the time. And it's actually very expensive to have them there because of all the translation that needs to take place. Moving on to the Court of Justice of the European Community. They're basically a supreme court of justice for community law cases. And basically all countries in the EU, or businesses or individuals, they're all bound by EU laws. Obviously, a lot of people think this is a good thing because the EU have set quite a lot of laws protecting people, but UKIP in particular, I think, are very against the EU setting our laws for our people. So there's a nice, interesting debate you could have there, but that'll probably be more social than economic. And finally, the ECB, the European Central Bank. It's basically in charge of the euro, which is used by the Eurozone. Currently 19 people in the Eurozone. That's independent of political intervention. It's sort of a separate sort of area. And the budget for it is separate from the EU budget, particularly because it doesn't contain all members of the EU. Notable examples that have stayed out are the UK. It publishes an annual report on its activities and has many key functions, which I believe are going to be on the next slide. The first function of the European Central Bank is price stability. We aim for 2% inflation. However, because of the presence of Germany and Angela Merkel, obviously if you remember, they had some quite serious inflation between the wars. They had hyperinflation. Angela Merkel is very, very, very keen on keeping inflation down, and a lot of people feel that inflation is kept down at the cost of economic growth and stuff like that. Next, monetary policy. Basically, the ECB is in charge of designing and implementing policies, so this is to do with a few key areas. Obviously, monetary policy tends to cover interest rates, quantitative easing, and exchange rates, I believe. Moving swiftly on to economic policies, basically the ECB has to support the member countries' policies because there's no point in having a high interest rate, which is going to cut spending, and then a low tax rate, which is going to increase spending, because they're just going to cancel each other out and have no effect whatsoever. Though it's important to remember that this is independent of political intervention. Moving on to the foreign exchange, it basically has to conduct exchange operations, nothing interesting there. And finally, the banking system, it does both banknotes and the banking system in general. So the banking system is ensuring the smooth operation, whereas banknotes is in charge of authorising the issue of banknotes and making sure they're protected from fraud and stuff like that. So you have to make sure that they've got metal strips in or holograms or whatever banknotes have these days. The single market is basically the removal of any obstacles to allow the free movement of goods and services, capital and persons, and obviously the EU is an example of a single market. The European Monetary Union is a group of Eurozone countries which are focused on liberalising the market for services. That's quite a posh word there, liberalising. Don't come across that one too often. And also improving the competitiveness within the market. Obviously more competition, more efficiency, and I think there's a lot more stuff on that in microeconomics. Hopefully I'm going to start making some micro videos soon. Before we look at the pros and cons of the single market, I'm actually going to refer you back to my Economics Unit 3 GCSE video. Obviously there's no point in watching it if you're really comfortable with this stuff, but I actually went back to look at my Unit 3 GCSE notes when I was making my A2 level notes, because there was so much stuff we did about the single market there, and it went into a bit more detail and it took it down to a really comfortable level. So I looked at that to get ideas for making my notes for pros and cons of single market, because I didn't think there was enough sort of content within the textbook and within the stuff that we were given. So if there's any concepts here about the single market you're not happy with or anything like that, it's right at the start of the Unit 3 GCSE video, so don't worry, you don't have to watch the whole hour. It's only the first few minutes, but it does all about the single market and pros and cons and stuff like that. Anyway, here are the pros and cons I've got here. The benefits, economies of scale. Obviously, if everyone's in the single market, and I believe in the EU there's almost 40% of world trade, where it's much easier to exploit economies of scale and the division of labour, leading to increased productivity and stuff like that, and then lower prices again and again and again, because there's a much bigger market to sell to. Next, increased dynamic efficiency, because there's much more competition, potentially reduced monopoly power. Everyone needs to be efficient and they need to innovate. So everyone's innovating loads. We've got new production processes, just new choice in general. So it's cheaper products and more choice. So it's great for everybody, except for the people that own the businesses, because they might see a fall in profits because they have to reinvest it all. Larger domestic market. Basically, because there's a greater audience, they have more people to sell to. So say you've got a product that's quite specific to a specific audience, and if you're just selling to your country, because you can't reach your minimum efficient scale, it's not worth producing it. If you've got 28 countries or however many there are in the EU, then you can produce it at a better point on your minimum efficient scale and sell it to other people, because there's actually a sufficient number of people in that market, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Also, we've got open borders within the EU, so that's cutting delivery time, and that's happy for everybody because no one likes waiting for a parcel. And finally, freedom of labour. Everyone's got the ability to work, study and retire elsewhere, so if you're bored of the UK, then off you toddle to Spain or Germany or wherever you want to go. And this also reduces the pressures of employment and unemployment. Say the UK has got full employment, but we've still got demand for people to do some work. We can get in some immigrants and get them to do the work for us, and vice versa. I think we've got lots of people working in lots of UK countries. Not UK, we've got lots of people working in lots of EU countries, same as we've got lots of EU people working in our country. Obviously, there's a lot of debate you can have about immigration. If you've got a question on immigration in the exam, just be careful not to make it really too social, because it needs to be all about the economic policies. Social thing you can sort of just slip in at the end, but don't do too much about that. Plus, you never know who's marking it. You could have like an immigrant marking it or something, and that'd be really unfortunate if you spent the whole essay parring off immigrants, especially because immigrants do so much for our economy. Moving on to the costs of the single market, inequality is a big one. Obviously within the EU we've got some rich countries and some poorer countries. I believe I've got a statistic somewhere here. You know, when all those countries came and joined us, the EU 10, they only added 5% to EU GDP. Their GDP was so much smaller than that of the existing member countries. So inequality between countries is definitely rife. I love that word. And basically we had a lot of capital and labour between countries, because we have free movement of labour, free movement of capital. Lots of capital moves from poorer areas to richer areas, so poorer areas got even poorer, which obviously isn't great to anyone. We still have delays in transporting goods and services and people because we do have separate national markets still, and national monopolies are going to be promoted by the government because the government wants its own industries to succeed. And also we've got different national tax systems and stuff like that, which does cause issues. Inability to compete. So say we've got a country that comes and joins, let's make up a country, let's call it Bosnia. I think that might exist. I'm pretty sure that country does exist. Definitely exists, Bosnia and Herzegovina, or however you pronounce it, which has a population of almost 4 million. Say a poor country did come and join us though, who simply couldn't compete because they didn't have the same resources and stuff like that. They would experience deindustrialisation and eventually unemployment as the industries they were promoting before moved elsewhere. So obviously you saw what happened to us with the coal miners. This might not have been to do with the EU, but we simply couldn't compete in producing coal, so we had massive unemployment and deindustrialisation. Structural unemployment is a particular issue when you've got a single market. And finally, single market gaps. Just because we've got a single market doesn't mean that everyone's happy. There are still some areas that need developing, such as intellectual property rights. Just put that one down and pretend to be posh. Apparently I've got a posh voice, but I don't think I've got a very posh voice. So, levels of integration, I always find this one really fun. Performance area happens when countries give lower tariffs on certain trade, moving on to a free trade area. There's no trade barriers between all the countries in the free trade area, and each member operates their own barrier against non-members. So remember, that's what we were in back in the day in 1958. We were a member of the EFTA, European Free Trade Area, and that's that one. Customs Union. Members eliminate trade barriers amongst themselves, and they have uniform barriers against non-members, so a common external tariff. So if you remember the European Economic Community that had the 6 members in, they had a common external tariff of 25%. Common market is basically a customs union that also has free movement of labour and capital, and that's what the EU is at the moment. And economic union is common market, which unifies its members' general objectives, so it harmonises monetary and fiscal policies. I know that the Eurozone area harmonises monetary policies. I'm not sure it's 100% harmonising fiscal policies. Pretty sure countries still have their own power over that. But that would be an economic union. It would basically be countries acting as one country, and there's pros and cons of that, definitely. In an economic union, financial contributions to the union itself might not actually directly benefit the payer. So you know how we have to give money to the EU every year or every so often, and we don't necessarily get that amount of money or that amount of benefits coming back to us, so you might actually have a net transfer of resources away from the country. That's definitely something that Nigel Farage is picking up on in his campaign. He's like, we give so much money to the EU every year and look what they do for us. They do nothing. Actually, they do quite a lot. Like, I saw a sign the other day in our town which had the EU flag on. It said the EU had done something. Don't know what it was, but the EU does definitely help us, and being a member is very useful in terms of trade, in terms of giving us a big position of power. And the other one is efficiency. So comparative advantages might not be fully exploited, leading to inefficiency because we're all acting as one market, if that makes sense. You'll be glad to know we're now halfway through the video. Woo! It's quite a long video here because the EU section is quite long. Moving on to trade deflection. Trade deflection is basically the redirection of international trade due to the free trade area. And basically this is quite controversial because traders import goods to members with the lowest tariffs, and then from that country there, they export goods to higher tariff members to sort of skip around the tariffs. So tariff systems can cause trade to do funny things and move it about and stuff like that, which is why we brought in the rules of origin, which basically means that free trade refers to a partner's produce, not to its imports. So basically, the product has to be manufactured from local components. You can't just import something and then export it to avoid the different tariff levels. And we also have intra-area trade, and that's not really part of the same thing. It's basically trade between members of a trading agreement. So instead of saying trade within the EU, you could put intra-area trade, and the examiner will probably be like, why are you trying to be cool? But it might look posh, so go for it. Also, thus. I feel if you haven't got thus into an essay, you've not done the job properly. I think thus has to be in every essay. In fact, in my essays, it's usually in every paragraph. I just love that word because I'm a fast writer and there's no time to write therefore. Thus just has to do. You sound like an idiot, though. Trade creation and diversion. Da-da-da. Trade creation is basically the increase in international trade resulting from the removal of protection. So basically you can reduce a firm's production costs and thus reduce prices for everybody. So we're going to look at the one on the left here. It's the impact of joining customs union on imported goods. So when we're outside the union, the price we're going to have is P plus T. So it's the top blue line there. Basically domestic supply is going to be E, so it's the second one in, and we're going to have to import E to A to get demand to meet supply, if that makes sense. Whereas if we're inside the union, on the one hand the price is P, so it's gone down, which is good. On the other hand, the amount we're supplying ourselves has gone down as well, and we're also importing more because demand has increased because the price has fallen. So it benefits people and it costs people. When we're outside the union, there's more that we can supply. We can definitely supply more, which is good for producers. When we're inside the union, supply goes down, but price goes down as well, which is great for people, for consumers, because they can buy more with their money. Their money seems to rise in value. And actually we have welfare created when we join a sort of customs union. We have welfare created of 1 plus 2 plus 3, which is all of that shaded area there. Whereas if we move to the one on the right, trade diversion, we actually lose all of that area in welfare. Basically on the right, when you join a union, you have to buy goods at a higher price inside the union because the common external barrier means that stuff outside the union, the world price is raised above that of the customs union price. So we actually have to buy price P outside the union. Outside the union we could get world price, which was cheaper. We got price P, but that wasn't necessarily great for producers because it meant that they supplied less and imported a lot more. Whereas when we moved to inside the union, the price became P plus T, which is a higher price, not great for consumers. They have to pay more because of the common tariff and that sort of thing. But it was great for suppliers because it meant they could supply more as well because the price was higher, so supply shifts to the right, I believe. And that meant that we imported less as well, which obviously has benefits for our current account. So when the EU was sort of formed and the new name happened in 1993, there was an agreement that Central and Eastern European countries could join. And we've actually had 16 countries joining the EU since then. 10 of them were the EU 10 in 2004. This has had many benefits and costs. A big benefit is a larger export market because we have the potential to increase our exports because we have more people to sell to. On the other hand, the incomes of the new members are actually at best 50% of the EU average. They don't actually have that much disposable income to buy our exports. So we say, yay, look, these people are here, they're going to buy all of our stuff. Actually, they haven't got that much money, they can't afford to do it. And because their income's lower, they tend to have a lower minimum wage or maybe an existent minimum wage, which means that they can produce cheaper and compete with us and maybe even destroy us. So basically, this could be a really bad thing for us. Free market economics. Basically, the new countries that have come and joined us have also got quite free market capitalist economies, which means low tax, which is good for demand. And they're also natural allies of Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism. That was the worst pronunciation ever. Neoliberalism? Maybe that's how it's pronounced. And Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism is the economic reform aimed at boosting dynamism. And this is literally the worst failure ever of economics. So rather than social reform, they're more about the economics. They think that if you have a free market, the freer the market, the freer the people, and if people are freer, they're going to be happier and better off. That sort of thing. Whereas, so basically we haven't allowed loads of communists in. Apologies for total failings in terms of pronunciation there. Just totally lost it. And finally, a power counterweight. Basically, at the moment in the EU, we've got Germany and France. They're quite strong, obviously. Basically, a lot of people say that Angela Merkel does run the EU. And basically, if we're allowing more countries in, these new 16 countries, these are going to act as sort of a power counterweight. So if we can get them on side, we can get them to vote against what France and Germany want. So we can restrict the power they have. We've already mentioned the EU 10, the 10 countries which joined the EU in 2004, particularly Eastern European countries, I believe. Let's look at the consequences of them joining. Population is the first one. The EU population actually increased by 100 million. I mean, I can't comprehend that number of people in my head. That's just a lot of people have joined the EU, which is great on the one hand because more demand and that sort of thing. But obviously, when you look at the bottom one there, migration, it's a touchy area. GDP. We've already mentioned this, it only added 5% to the EU's GDP, not really a great amount. It'd be better if it made it much bigger and much stronger. Scaremongering, I think we all know who's responsible for this. In fact, my notes just says Nigel Farage. which isn't very good news. I probably ought to put a bit more in there. But basically, the idea that we've got loads of health tourists and benefits tourists coming over here, I mean, it's quite ridiculous, really. If you look at the figures, the number of health tourists is minute. People simply don't come over here just to get benefits from the NHS. Some people might come here, then get ill and use the NHS, but I think it's fair enough if they come here to work, then if they get ill, then we may as well treat them. So I'm going to try to keep my political views out of here. Moving on to capital. Lots of migration of capital from the West into new entrants, which isn't great because it's reduced our sort of productive capacity. So if you imagine the PPB, technically you could say that's shifted inwards because we've lost some of our capital. But on the other hand, we've had migrants coming over here, which have increased our productive sort of capacity in terms of employment. There's more people we can employ and that sort of thing. Constitution, posh thing there. Basically, because we've had new people coming in, the EU itself and the way it's run has to be slightly redesigned to ensure the decisions can still be made that benefit as many people as possible. So basically, a bit of redesigning there can be quite expensive. Obviously, 10 more people coming in, 10 more languages maybe, or at least a few more languages, which has increased the costs a lot of translation and stuff like that. And finally, migration. There's been a lot of migration from the east to the west, particularly with countries without restrictions on immigration and stuff like that. And if you do live in the UK, you'll obviously see a lot of debate about the migration and stuff like that happening at the moment, and immigration happening in all of the political debates right now. It's getting really exciting. I think it's, 4 days until the election. I'm so excited. I mean, you know the saying, never talk about religion and politics in public and with other people. Well, they're my two favourite areas of conversation, so always happy to have a bit of a debate on one of them. I had to re-record this slide, I was doing an Australian accent. Anyway, the Eurozone was formed on the 1st of January 1999, currently has 19 members. The single currency, the euro, which was formed, replaced all the national currencies of all of these 19 members, and the euro now operates in the foreign exchange markets, also known as Forex, as a managed float. So if you remember the exchange rates we were doing back in the last video, the managed float is the one where it fluctuates between two sort of levels. Pretty sure we've already talked about how it has an independent central bank which regulates the members' interests in the monetary policy, but it's sort of separate of politics and separate of the EU as a whole. So it tries to benefit everybody who's within it, but it doesn't try to take political sort of pushing about and that sort of thing. And finally, there's a Stability and Growth Pact of all Eurozone members, which limits public sector borrowing of the members to 3% of GDP, which isn't really that much at all. And it's not even listened to, really. I think it was broached by Portugal, Italy, France and Germany. And it's interesting if you look at those countries, imagine if it was broached by other people and other people have borrowed more. Imagine the reaction Germany could have had. You never know. In 2005, this rule was actually relaxed to allow extra supply-side spending to increase your supply-side capacity and that sort of thing. But it was meant to be in place just to keep the monetary policy together and stop countries from frustrating it. The single currency, this is definitely one that we did at GCSE as well, Unit 3. Lots of benefits, lots of costs. Benefits, lower interest rates. Basically, interest rates move for economics rather than politics. So people that are in the Eurozone have got relatively low interest rates, which encourages growth and stuff like that. Reduced exchange rate uncertainty is reduced for inter-union trade because you know that everyone that you're trading with has got the same exchange rate as you, and it's going to change exactly the same as you, although you've still got uncertainty with the rest of the world. And there's also reduced risk of devaluation against any other country that is in the Eurozone because they're in the Eurozone as well. Increased intra-EMU competition. Basically, there's a greater market size within the European Monetary Union, so there's more efficiency. You're selling to more people, so there's more businesses and stuff. If there's more competition, then more efficiency, essentially, because you have to be efficient. You have to keep investing your money to come up with new processes. You have to be dynamically efficient in order to sort of stay in the game, really. And also it's easier to compare prices as well because everyone's got the same currency. So if you're going to go compare a website at the moment and you're comparing prices between UK and Germany, we've got two different currencies, that's going to be really hard to sort of compare the prices because prices change against each other all the time. Whereas if you're comparing between two prices that both have the euro, it's a lot easier to compare prices. So that encourages competition as well. There's increased FDI for those who are in the EMU because there's reduced exchange rate risks with investment because you know that if you've both got euros, there's not going to be devaluation or revaluation or stuff like that, so your investment should maintain its value. although this isn't great for the UK because it means that firms can shift their FDI from the UK to the EMU where it's more certain, because previously the UK got a lot of FDI coming in from all across the Eurozone and all across the EU in general, whereas now FDI is starting to sort of shift away from us, apparently. And finally, reduced transaction costs. So there's a lower cost of foreign exchange sort of transactions and stuff like that, which has actually boosted the GDP of people in the Eurozone by an average of 0.4%, because they don't have to change between the euro and the pound or whatever currency they've got, because they've all got the euro, you don't have to do those transactions. But 0.4% is actually a massive boost to GDP, and because that's the average, some countries have had a lot more than that, obviously some have got less, but massive shift to GDP, which is great for national income, great for living standards and stuff like that. Say previously you wanted to buy a horse but it was in another currency, so you had to pay the costs of transaction and changing your money across before you bought the horse. Now you don't have to do all that to buy the horse, so your money basically is worth more. They're playing Bananagrams next door and I really want to go join in. The big cost of a single currency is basically the loss of the independent monetary policy, because if you've got your own monetary policy, you can change it as you need it, as your economy needs it and stuff like that. Whereas if you've all got the same monetary policy, it can't be changed to meet you. And a particular one that's important for this is asymmetric policy sensitivity. It's the bottom one, but it's the first one I think of all the time. Think of UK mortgages. People in the UK are a lot more likely to have a mortgage to pay off than people in other Eurozone countries. So changes in interest rates affect the UK aggregate demand a lot more, because if they go up, people's mortgages go up, and so their disposable income goes right down, whereas in other countries it won't go down quite as much. Obviously that one sort of links back to the top as well, different priorities. So we've got different economic conditions throughout the EMU, and UK employment is often treated with a lot less importance by the ECB than the Bank of England, because obviously the ECB, the European Central Bank, has a lot of countries to deal with. The Bank of England is only about England, only about English politics and stuff like that, English economics, so it can be a lot more adapted to that country, whereas a single currency for the EU as a whole, the Eurozone, is going to be a lot less effective for individual countries. Again, we've already mentioned Germany's determination to keep inflation low, and a lot of people argue that the ECB is sort of too deflationary, it's too concerned about keeping inflation low at the expense of growth. So basically, economic growth could be a lot higher if we weren't so worried about inflation. And obviously for the UK right now, we don't really need to care about inflation. We've got 0% inflation at the moment, so inflation isn't something we need to worry about. But for other countries in the ECB and the European Central Bank, no, in the Eurozone, it's a lot more of a worry for them, so it's not adapted to meet our needs. Say you could previously remain competitive because whenever you had a balance payments deficit, you would just see your currency fall in value. Now we've all got the same currency, so that's not really going to work for you. You're going to have to cut your wages to remain competitive, and that's obviously not ideal. It's massively problematic. It leads to a fall in living standards and stuff like that. So being part of a single currency can have a massive impact on your ability to retain competitiveness and then therefore keep your living standards at a sustainable and sustainably high level. Obviously the UK decided not to join the Eurozone, and there were a lot of reasons for this, but Gordon Brown put out 5 economic tests he said the UK would have to pass before it joined the EMU. The first one is economic convergence. Basically, the UK's economic cycle doesn't match with the EU's, partly due to the fact that we do more non-EU trade than the rest of the EU, and we're also the only oil exporter, really. So it'd be hard for interest rates set by the EMU to benefit all of us. And particularly if say we were going through an up time and they were going through a down time, they'd want to put interest rates down and we'd want to put them up, and it would be quite difficult. So before we joined the EMU, we'd want to have the same sort of economic cycle as them. At the moment, we're a bit more flexible in terms of coping with economic shocks than the rest of the EMU. We've got more labour flexibility and mobility. Our workers are happy to accept lower wage levels, or they're probably unhappy, but they kind of do. People accept temporary and part-time contracts, and trade union power is, well, some would say it's rising, but some would say it's falling, which is sort of making us more able to cope with shocks in terms of within the labour market. We can adapt to changing conditions, whereas the rest of the EMU isn't so able to cope with shocks, so we'd want them to be able to cope with shocks a lot better before we were happy to join with them. And we'd also lose a lot of this power if we join the EMU, and we might lose our ability to cope with shocks and that sort of thing. I mean, the rest of the EMU actually suffers from Eurosclerosis, I think that's how it's pronounced, which is basically when they've got high unemployment and slow job creation despite having economic growth. So basically economic growth isn't being beneficial in the labour market, probably helping capital and stuff like that. But when you've got people, you need more employment. And if we've still got high unemployment and economic growth, it's not an ideal situation. And obviously the UK doesn't want to end up suffering from that as well. Say we stay out of the European Monetary Union and we have a strong pound. UK firms will actually move to the EMU because they will see trading as better. Because obviously if we've got a strong pound, then our exports and consequently the firm's exports are going to look more expensive on the international market, which isn't great for a firm. So say we stay out of the EMU and we've got a strong pound, UK firms will probably move to the EMU to benefit from weaker euro, essentially a weaker exchange rate. On the other hand, if we've got a weak pound, that'll make our exports seem cheaper and we could potentially be discriminated against by the EMU, who are sort of jealous of our strong position. Obviously, we know that the EMU's policy is to keep interest rates low, and if we did join the EMU, we'd have low interest rates, which would lead to higher share prices, and having higher share prices would be a lot better for traders because they'd sort of see the value of the money they've invested rise and stuff like that. So that would be good news for traders. And also, if we had a reduced interest rate, we'd see increased aggregate demand, which could be good because it's great for businesses if consumption rises, but it could also be bad because it often puts a lot of pressure on housing market. Also, this is one to put in general for the EU because it's a single market now. We've got lots of people moving here, which is putting pressure on the housing market as well. And in order to sort of counteract this, the government would have to use fiscal measures, particularly tax. Would have to increase tax, and that's never popular. So, just a few things to think about there. Woo! That's the end of the European Union section of Economics Unit 4. Also the end of Economics Unit 4 as a whole. Hooray, because my voice has totally given up. Hopefully you've made it here. If you've made it here, then well done. You've put up with me for God knows how long. Probably too long, so congratulations to you. As always, I'll thank my economics teachers here from this year and throughout the years who have given me the sort of understanding and knowledge that I've got in order to make these videos, which have hopefully helped you, and if they haven't, well, you've probably wasted way too much of your life. But, oh well. Anyway, best of luck with the exam and the other exam as well, and see you soon, maybe. Goodbye!